Good morning. Today we're starting a new unit. The new unit is going to be about body systems in human beings, such as the skeletal system, the muscular system, the circulatory system, the respiratory system, and many more. We're going to be learning about the functions of body systems and how the body systems work together to keep a sense of balance in the human body, even if there is a change from outside the body or inside the body that can threaten harm to the human being. But before we can get there, we need to learn about cells and the cell theory. So by the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain what the cell theory states. Now, before we can get into the cell theory, we need to look at what a cell is, as well as some of the scientific discoveries that were made. First of all, cells are very small structures that carry out different functions in organisms. When I mean small, I mean they are microscopic, meaning we need a light microscope to view them. Light microscopes can magnify tiny tiny cells hundreds of times so that you can see some of the structures, such as the cell membrane on the outside or the nucleus. Cells also, when I say are the smallest unit of life, they carry out different jobs, such as breaking down big molecules of food into smaller little building blocks. They help with movement, they help with growth, they help with reproduction. So if one of your cells is damaged or dies, your cells are able to copy themselves to create a new copy of the cell that's identical. That also includes making egg cells and sperm cells for human reproduction. Now, basic cells look something like this. In a cartoonish version, we have an animal cell on the right, we have a plant cell on the left, and there are tiny little structures in the cells that do different jobs. We're going to be learning about some of these structures in the near future, at least some really important structures that carry out very major jobs in the cell. Before we go into some of the scientists and their discoveries, take a moment and make a guess at about how many cells you think are in the human body. Jot that down. Now, your body is made of about 100 trillion cells. Those cells make up all the different organs and organ systems. They make up your brain, your eyes, your digestive system, the muscle that makes up your skeletal muscle, or the muscle that makes up your heart, your nervous system, so on and so forth. They all perform different jobs, but there are over 100 trillion of them. Knowing about the basic size of the cell versus how big the human body generally is, scientists have been able to calculate that this is about the approximate amount in a human being at their adult size. First, we're going to be looking at some of the discoveries of the different scientists that led to the discovery of the cell theory and cells. First, we have Robert Hooke. Robert Hooke discovered cells in their simplest form. He was looking at a piece of wood from a tree, so he took this thin little slice of cork and he put him under some very, very simple lenses. And what he saw, first of all, he saw something more like this picture on the right. He saw these tiny little boxes with some dark areas. The dark areas actually do have little structures that do jobs, but what he saw were darkened areas and little walls. Now, he likened those walls with the empty space that he was seeing as little rooms that he called cells. So that's how the term cell was coined. Then there was the next scientist called Anton von Leeuwenhoek. He is actually credited with building the first very simple microscope. The simple microscope that he built is actually similar to the one in this picture over here. There's a very, very small lens over here. There's a sample holder, very similar to the stage on a light microscope these days, that he was able to place here and take a look at the sample under his lens. And then there was a focus knob to adjust the focus of the lenses. This is also very similar to a light microscope, as we also have two different types of focus knobs on those microscopes as well. So what he did was he took a little bit of pond water and he put it on the sample holder and viewed it under the lens here. And he saw tiny little organisms that were very similar to bacteria, or may have even been bacteria. Um, so he was seeing little organisms like the one on the left, he was seeing tiny organisms like the one on the right, using that simple microscope. And he was able to see that there were different structures or different looks to these cells. We then have Schleiden. Schleiden was a botanist, so he was one of the first scientists to be able to see that plants were made of cells, and he was able to see that they also had a very specific look. Plant cells usually have a very boxy look to them. He was able to see this from a piece of a plant leaf. Then we were able to go on to the next scientist. The next scientist's name was Schwann. Now, Theodor Schwann was somebody who was able to see that animals were made of cells. I actually am able to give you the advice of remembering these two scientists. To me, Schwann sounds like the word swan, and Schwann was a zoologist, which means he studied animals for a living, so swan is an animal, so Schwann discovered cells in animals. He was able to view that under a very simple microscope. So an image on the right is what would be more of a set of cells in an animal. Now notice that they have a pink look. Can't really see animal cells unless they've been stained under the microscope. Otherwise they appear clear and are very difficult to see. Unlike plant cells where they already have pigments in them, such as green color. And then we're going to move on to Rudolf Virchow. He came up with a part of the cell theory that says that all cells come from pre-existing cells. This just means that your cells were able to reproduce and make new cells, so every time a cell reproduces, it's because they had the ability of coming from a cell that existed before it. So after a while, there were a few parts of the cell theory that each of these scientists helped build based on the observations of Hooke, Leeuwenhoek, Schleiden, Schwann, Virchow. They were all able to come up with parts of this. These parts of the cell theory are widely accepted, although there are a few exceptions to this rule that we're going to look at as well. So the three parts of the cell theory are that all organisms are composed of cells. That came from Schleiden and Schwann, in the sense that Schleiden said that he was able to observe cells in all plants, so plants are made of cells. Schwann, who saw that animals were made of cells, so all animals are made of cells, and Leeuwenhoek, who was able to see microscopic organisms that lived in pond water, so they are composed of cells, whether they are little algae cells or bacteria cells that live in the water. Another part of the cell theory is that the cell is the basic unit of life in living things. So that's number 2 in our theory. So as I said, the cells can do different jobs for us. They help with reproduction, they help with growth and movement. And then the third part, which came from Virchow, where all cells are produced from pre-existing cells. As I said, there are a few different exceptions that have to be thought of, and that includes the following. So some exceptions to cell theory. Viruses, ones that cause things such as the flu virus, they're not usually viewed as cells, and the reason for that is because viruses require other cells. What viruses do is they kind of hijack our cells, and they use our cells' own little structures to help produce more viruses. So they take over a cell, they produce a lot of viruses, and then the new viruses burst out of the cell and destroy it, all in an effort to go infect more cells to make more copies of itself. It's for that reason that viruses aren't really viewed as being a cell themselves, because without another organism cells, they can't reproduce. Another exception to the cell theory is just kind of like the question of which came first, the chicken or the egg. In the case of a cell, where did the first cell come from? It couldn't have come from a pre-existing cell. So one exception to the cell theory is, where did the first cell come from? And then our third exception is we have two different little structures in the cell, one called the mitochondria that makes energy for us, and another one called the chloroplast, which makes food for different plants. Now, these two organelles have their own genetic information, which means at some point they possibly lived as independent organisms that got absorbed into plant cells and animal cells at some point. So they may, in this case, they may have been their own cells at one point or another. If you guys have questions about any of this information, feel free to jump into office hours today at 12. There's a little bit of an activity. The activity is just to go through the information in the slides and the video that you're listening to now, and just sum up what you've learned about each of these scientists. I will try to post a video about the cell theory as well. After this lesson starting next week, we're going to go over some parts of the cells, and then we're going to start jumping into some of the body systems and going over some general information about those. Thank you, and have a nice day.